Aurora descended from the crystalline skyship with 3 thermal rifles and a heart full of rage. The elf warrior had traveled across 7 star systems for one purpose: to destroy the human colony that had slaughtered her family. Her silver hair caught the twin sunset light as she surveyed the settlement below, her pointed ears twitching with anticipation. The wind carried the scent of unfamiliar vegetation and something metallic that made her skin crawl. She had been planning this journey for 18 months, counting every day while her grief transformed into pure determination. The colony below was called New Haven, a place of lies and death where her sister had died 2 years ago. Aurora checked her weapons one last time. The thermal rifles were fully charged. The plasma grenades were secured in her belt. She was ready for war. 2 dragons emerged from the clouds beside her transport vessel as the sun dipped lower on the horizon. Ember, the copper-scaled male, moved with the grace of a predator who had hunted across 3 galaxies. His eyes were like molten gold, ancient and knowing. Thistle, the jade-colored female, shrieked a battle cry that echoed across the alien plain so loudly that birds scattered from distant trees. These were not earth dragons. They were creatures of pure magic and fury, creatures that had bonded with Aurora since she was merely a child on her distant homeworld. Her mother had placed Thistle in her arms when she was only 5 years old. Ember had chosen her of his own will when she reached adulthood. Now they were her closest family, her only family since the attack. Aurora whispered the ancient words of her people, and her dragons understood instantly. The connection between elf and dragon went deeper than language. It was written in blood and magic and centuries of shared history. They knew the mission. They knew the target. But something unexpected happened when they crested the first ridge overlooking the human settlement. The colony sprawled across the valley below like a wound on the landscape. Metal buildings gleamed in the fading light. Automated defenses hummed with power. Security towers stood at every corner, watching, always watching. Aurora had studied the layout for months. She knew every building, every patrol route, every weakness. She was going to burn this place to the ground. A figure emerged from the colony entrance just as Aurora raised her rifle to aim. It was a woman moving slowly with hands raised in peace. She was dark-skinned and wore the white medical coat of a civilian worker. Behind her stood only 2 security officers, both with weapons lowered and unthreatening. The woman did not look frightened. That was strange. Most humans looked frightened when they saw elf warriors with dragons. Most humans ran. Most humans screamed. But this woman simply walked forward with her hands open and her expression calm, as if greeting an old friend rather than facing an enemy who could destroy everything she knew. Aurora's finger tensed on her rifle trigger. This was deception. This had to be deception. Humans always lied. Humans always attacked first and spoke second. That was what Aurora had learned in her 23 years of life. That was what the human race had taught her when they murdered her family. Her dragons sensed her rage and howled in response, their voices shaking the ground beneath their feet. But the woman did not flinch. She took another step forward, closing the distance between them slowly and deliberately. "Your sister," the human woman called out, and Aurora felt her entire body freeze as if someone had trapped her in ice. "My name is Victoria Monroe, and I knew your sister." She spoke these words with such certainty, with such complete confidence that Aurora could not immediately process what she was hearing. How could this human possibly know about Lyra? How could she know that Aurora had a sister? The information was classified, hidden away in official elf records. No human should have known these details. No human should have even suspected that Aurora's family existed. For hours that night, Aurora stood with her dragons overlooking the settlement, while Victoria waited patiently at the colony entrance. The human woman did not leave. She did not run. She simply sat on the ground with her hands visible and her eyes closed, waiting. When dawn came, Victoria was still there. When the sun reached its highest point, she was still there. Thistle approached her with caution, her jade scales catching the light as she moved. The dragon lowered her massive head toward the human woman, and Victoria did not scream or pull away. She reached out one small hand and touched Thistle's snout, and the dragon made a sound like purring, a sound of acceptance. Aurora finally descended the ridge. She walked down the slope with her dragons flanking her, their presence both protection and threat. Victoria stood up slowly when she saw them approach. The human woman was perhaps in her 4th decade of life, with lines around her eyes that suggested she had seen difficult things. She wore a small pendant around her neck shaped like a crescent moon. When Aurora saw it, her breath caught in her throat. That symbol was the mark of the Silverwood family. Aurora's family. Lyra must have given her that pendant. Victoria began to speak, and as the story unfolded, Aurora felt the world shifting around her like sand giving way beneath her feet. Victoria had been a medical researcher on this colony 2 years ago. Lyra had crashed here during a diplomatic mission, her transport damaged by sabotage. Victoria had found her in the wreckage, wounded but alive. She had hidden Lyra in the medical facility, treating her injuries in secret, nursing her back to health. They had become friends in those quiet days when no one else knew what was happening. But then the order had come down from a man named Commander Walsh. He wanted elf prisoners. He wanted to dissect them, to study them, to learn the secrets of elf technology. He had planned an ambush. He had known exactly when and where Lyra would be traveling. Someone had betrayed her. Someone from within the elf delegation. The attack had been deliberate and calculated. Lyra's transport had crashed and everyone aboard had been pronounced dead. But Victoria had recovered Lyra's body before the military could take it. She had put her in a stasis pod, a medical device designed to keep beings alive in perfect suspension indefinitely. She had kept her hidden for 2 entire years, waiting and hoping that somehow, someday, someone would come looking for Lyra. And then Victoria had managed to send a message across the stars, a signal hidden in commercial transmissions that only someone from Lyra's family would recognize. That signal had reached Aurora, and now the elf warrior finally understood why she was standing here instead of fighting a battle. Everything she thought she knew about this mission had changed in the span of a few hours. The woman before her was not an enemy. She was the reason Lyra might still be alive. The medical facility beneath New Haven was colder than Aurora expected. Victoria led her down a series of narrow corridors that descended deep into the earth, past sealed doors and security checkpoints that Victoria bypassed with codes and passwords that she clearly should not have possessed. The human woman moved with the confidence of someone who had made this journey hundreds of times before. Ember and Thistle followed close behind, their wings brushing against the metal walls, leaving small scorch marks on the cold surface. No one stopped them. Victoria had made arrangements. She had prepared for this moment. The guards at each checkpoint looked away as they passed, pretending not to see the elf warrior and her dragons walking through their secure facility. When they finally reached the chamber where Lyra lay, Aurora had to place her hand against the wall to steady herself. The stasis pod was transparent, revealing everything within. Her sister's face was peaceful, unmarked by the trauma of the crash. Her silver hair, identical in color and shade to Aurora's own, lay spread across a soft cushion. She wore the formal diplomatic robes of the Elf Council, the clothes she had been wearing the day she died, or the day she had been frozen in time while waiting for rescue. 2 years she had been sleeping in this pod, 2 years without knowing if anyone was coming for her, 2 years of Victoria watching over her, keeping her safe. Aurora pressed her hand against the pod's cool surface. She could feel the slight vibration of the life support systems working to keep Lyra suspended in a state between life and death, preserved perfectly in a moment, frozen in time. Tears streamed down Aurora's face, though she made no sound. The elf warrior had not cried since the day she received news of Lyra's death. She had buried that grief deep inside, transforming it into rage and purpose and the will to destroy. Now that grief came flooding back, mixed with hope, with gratitude, with something she had thought was lost forever. Her sister was alive, not dead, not gone forever. Alive. Victoria waited patiently nearby, giving Aurora space for her emotion. The human woman leaned against a wall with her arms crossed, understanding the magnitude of what this moment meant. After several minutes, Victoria spoke softly about the technical requirements for bringing Lyra out of stasis. The process had to be done carefully. The transition from suspended animation to normal consciousness could cause serious damage if rushed. Victoria had the medical knowledge and the equipment needed, but she would need help. She needed someone who could monitor Lyra's physical response, someone who understood elf biology well enough to anticipate complications. Aurora finally looked away from her sister's frozen form. She asked Victoria a simple question: why? Why had the human woman risked so much to keep Lyra hidden? Why had she betrayed her own people, her own military, her own government? Victoria took a long time before answering. She explained that she had been a medical researcher her entire adult life. Her purpose was healing, not harming. When Commander Walsh had ordered her to prepare dissection materials to begin studying elf physiology, she had refused. She had tried to convince him that such actions would only lead to war, to suffering, to the destruction of everything the colony was trying to build in this distant star system. Walsh had not cared about her concerns. He had become obsessed with the idea that elf technology could be stolen and copied, if they could understand how elf bodies worked. He believed that elf biology was somehow inherently technological, that studying elf flesh would unlock the secrets of their advanced civilization. His obsession had twisted into something ugly and violent. When Victoria continued to refuse his orders, he had stopped asking and started commanding. He had begun planning the ambush. He had arranged for Lyra's transport to be sabotaged, and then, when it was done, he had claimed that all the elf diplomats had died in the crash. Victoria had been the only person at the crash site who knew the truth. She had recovered Lyra before anyone else could reach the wreckage. She had carried her body to the medical facility in the middle of the night. She had discovered that Lyra was not dead, merely unconscious and badly injured. She had made a choice in that moment that had changed the trajectory of her entire life. She had decided to save this elf woman instead of reporting her to her commander. She had decided that one person standing against the darkness was better than no one standing at all. The stasis pods. Control panel showed that Lyra had enough oxygen and nutrient supply to remain in suspension for another 3 months. That meant they had time. They could plan carefully. They could gather evidence. They could expose the truth about what Walsh had done without immediately forcing Lyra back into consciousness and into a world that still contained the people who had tried to kill her. Victoria had already been preparing for this for months. She had been collecting evidence, documenting everything Walsh had done, everything Hayes had done. She had communications logs and security footage and medical records that proved the massacre of Lyra's diplomatic team was not an accident but a deliberate act of violence. Ember moved closer to the stasis pod and made a low humming sound deep in his chest. Dragons could sense the presence of their own kind in some mysterious way that had never been fully explained to humans. Even though Lyra was suspended in stasis, Ember recognized her as a person, as a fellow consciousness in the world. He curled his tail around the base of the pod in a protective gesture. Thistle joined him, and soon both dragons were circling the life support chamber with their eyes fixed on Lyra's frozen face. They understood that she was important. They understood that they were here to protect her. Aurora realized in that moment that her mission had transformed. She had come to this planet to destroy, to rain fire and death down upon the humans who had killed her family. But standing in this underground chamber, looking at her sister preserved in suspended animation, surrounded by dragons and cared for by a human woman who had chosen compassion over obedience, Aurora understood that there was another way. There was another path. The path to justice did not have to be the path of vengeance. Sometimes justice required patience. Sometimes it required working with unlikely allies. Sometimes it required believing that humans could be better than their worst examples. Victoria placed a gentle hand on Aurora's shoulder. The human woman's touch was warm and grounding. She offered to show Aurora the rest of the evidence she had gathered. She offered to introduce her to other colonists who had also resisted Walsh's orders, who had also refused to participate in the massacre. There were more humans here than Aurora had imagined who believed in peace rather than war. There were more humans here who had been waiting for someone like Aurora to arrive, hoping that somehow the elf worlds would eventually learn the truth about what had really happened to Lyra's diplomatic team. The night had passed and dawn was breaking over the colony. Aurora and Victoria and the two dragons emerged from the underground facility as the sun rose over the alien landscape, casting long shadows across the metal buildings and defensive walls. The warrior's mission was evolving into something far more complicated and far more meaningful than she had ever imagined it could be. Aurora spent the next 3 days hidden in Victoria's residential quarters, on the upper level of the New Haven settlement. The human woman's home was small but carefully arranged, filled with artifacts and items that revealed her true character and beliefs. There were plants growing from soil brought from Earth, things Victoria had cultivated and cared for despite living on an alien world. There were books, hundreds of physical books which surprised Aurora because most modern humans stored information digitally. There was a wall covered with photographs showing Victoria's life before she came to this colony. In some pictures she was younger, standing with an older woman who must have been her mother. In others, she stood with colleagues in medical uniforms. But one picture showed Victoria standing beside Lyra, both of them smiling at the camera, their arms linked together in friendship. The photograph was dated 3 years ago, just before Lyra's crash. Thistle and Ember remained in Victoria's quarters with them, though their large bodies barely fit through the standard doorways. Victoria had arranged for food to be brought in regularly, enough to feed both the dragons and the elf warrior. The colony's other residents had been informed that the visitor was a diplomatic envoy who needed to discuss urgent matters with the settlement leadership. This was not entirely a lie. It was just not the whole truth. Throughout those 3 days, Victoria showed Aurora everything she had collected. Communication logs between Commander Walsh and Colonel Hayes discussing the planned ambush. Financial records showing that Walsh had been receiving payments from off-world military contractors who wanted elf technology and biological samples. Medical reports that had been falsified to claim that all passengers on Lyra's transport had died in the crash. Security footage showing soldiers collecting wreckage and searching for survivors, with orders to find and eliminate any elf they discovered alive. The evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. Commander Walsh had orchestrated the massacre not because of military necessity or some misguided sense of security, but because he had been paid to do it. Contractors from the Outer Rim wanted elf genetic material and elf technology. They had offered Walsh a fortune to deliver them both. He had accepted the offer without hesitation. He had given the order to destroy Lyra's diplomatic transport. He had personally selected the soldiers who carried out the attack. And then he had covered it up with false reports and forged documents. Colonel Hayes had been his willing partner in this conspiracy. She had helped him destroy evidence. She had helped him intimidate witnesses. She had helped him keep the truth hidden for 2 years. Aurora felt the rage returning, but it was different now. This was not the blind rage of grief and loss. This was the focused rage of someone who had been shown clear evidence of injustice and understood exactly who was responsible. She wanted to find Walsh and Hayes and make them answer for what they had done. But she understood now that simply killing them would not be enough. Simple death was too easy, too merciful for people who had committed such calculated crimes. She wanted them to face justice. She wanted the galaxy to know what they had done. She wanted the elf worlds to understand that not all humans were monsters, and that humanity itself contained the capacity to stand against its own darkness. Victoria introduced her to 3 other colonists, who had secretly resisted Walsh's orders and had been waiting for someone to arrive who could help them expose the truth. There was a security officer named Marcus, who had refused to participate in the massacre and had been passed over for promotions as punishment. There was a communications technician named Linda, who had discovered Walsh's encrypted communications with the off-world contractors and had been searching for someone she could trust with the information. There was an engineer named David who had sabotaged equipment that could have been used to extract and preserve elf biological material for study. These 3 humans had been taking enormous personal risks, working secretly to oppose Walsh's agenda from within the colony. Together, the group began to formulate a plan. They could not simply arrest Walsh because he was no longer on the colony. He had been reassigned to an orbital military station 3 weeks ago, promoted by his superiors who had no idea of his crimes and no awareness of the conspiracy he was engaged in. But Colonel Hayes was still here. She was still on New Haven. She was still vulnerable and accessible. If they could arrest her and interrogate her, they could force her to reveal the details of Walsh's off-world connections. They could expose the entire conspiracy. The challenge was that Hayes controlled the colony's security forces. She had loyal soldiers who would follow her orders without question. She had access to weapons and defense systems. She could declare martial law if she felt threatened. She could attempt to silence them all if she realized they were gathering evidence against her. Aurora understood the risks. She understood that attempting to arrest Hayes within the colony could turn into an armed conflict. But she also understood that this was exactly what Walsh and Hayes would expect from an elf warrior with dragons. They would expect rage and violence and direct confrontation. So instead, they planned something more subtle. Victoria and Marcus would go to Hayes with a proposition. They would tell her that an elf warrior had arrived on the colony, seeking Lyra, seeking revenge. They would tell her that the elf warrior could not be stopped by conventional military force, that dragons were involved, that the colony was in grave danger. They would convince Hayes that her only option was to evacuate immediately, to abandon the settlement and report back to her superiors that the colony was being overrun. Meanwhile, Aurora and Thistle and Ember would position themselves to capture Hayes the moment she tried to leave. They would take her alive. They would bring her into custody. Victoria was nervous about the plan. She kept asking if Aurora was certain it would work. The elf warrior simply smiled, an expression that still looked strange on her face because she had not smiled in so long. She explained that she had studied human psychology and human military tactics as part of her training. Humans responded predictably to threats. Show them danger, show them an escape route, and most humans would take it. Hayes was a career soldier, someone who would prioritize her own survival over her principles. She would run, and when she ran, they would be waiting. Ember and Thistle listened to the plan and made sounds of agreement. The dragons understood strategy. They understood patience. They had not survived across 3 galaxies by being impulsive or reckless. They had survived by being smart and adaptable and fierce when the moment came to be fierce. Aurora looked at Victoria and saw something in the human woman's expression that reminded her of her mother. There was the same determination, the same willingness to do what was right regardless of the cost. There was the same belief that individuals could make a difference. There was the same hope that the galaxy could be better than it currently was. Tomorrow they would begin the next phase. Tomorrow they would set the trap. Tomorrow they would confront Colonel Hayes and force her to face the consequences of her actions. But tonight, Aurora sat in Victoria's small home with her dragons curled around her and the human woman beside her, and she allowed herself to believe that justice was possible, that truth could triumph over lies, that humans and elves could work together toward something meaningful. The night seemed full of possibility, and for the first time since arriving on this world, Aurora felt something other than rage. The confrontation with Colonel Hayes happened at the settlement's administrative center on a bright morning, when the twin suns were high in the sky. Victoria and Marcus approached Hayes with urgency in their movements and fear evident in their voices. They told her that an elf warrior with dragons had landed outside the colony perimeter. They said the elf warrior was seeking revenge for the massacre of her family. They explained that they had tried to negotiate, but the elf would not listen. She was preparing to attack. The colony's defensive systems would be insufficient to stop a determined assault from magical creatures. Their only option was immediate evacuation. Hayes listened to their report with growing alarm. She understood the military implications immediately. Dragons with ancient magic could potentially breach their defenses. An elf warrior with advanced technology and combat training would be a formidable opponent. She had no interest in dying on this backwater colony for principles that no longer seemed to matter. She began issuing evacuation orders, authorizing immediate transport off-world. She assembled a small security detail to accompany her to the landing pad. She gathered the most important files and data from her office. She was going to escape exactly as Aurora had predicted she would, but when Hayes and her detail emerged from the administrative building, they found Ember and Thistle blocking their path. The copper dragon and the jade dragon stood side by side, their wings spread wide, their eyes glowing with an ancient intelligence. The dragons did not move to attack. They simply stood there, magnificent and terrible and utterly impossible to ignore. The soldiers in Hayes' detail raised their weapons, but before they could fire, Aurora stepped out from behind Ember. She held no gun. She held no visible weapon. She simply held her hands open and empty, and she spoke to Hayes with complete authority. The elf warrior told Colonel Hayes that she was under arrest for crimes against the diplomatic corps of the elf worlds. She was under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder. She was under arrest for covering up the massacre of innocent beings. She explained that she could surrender peacefully or she could attempt to resist and the dragons would stop her. There was no third option. There was no escape. The colony's launch pads were surrounded by Victoria's allies. The orbital communications had been disabled by Linda. There was nowhere to run. Hayes faced a choice in that moment. She could attempt to fight her way out, knowing that such an attempt would likely result in her death or severe injury. She could surrender and face justice through the legal systems that governed multiple worlds. The military officer considered her options for only a few seconds. Her soldiers lowered their weapons. She ordered them to stand down. She placed her hands behind her head in the universal gesture of surrender. She came peacefully, moving down from the administrative building toward where Aurora stood waiting. The elf warrior placed restraint devices on Hayes' wrists. The devices were harmless but completely secure, designed by elf technology to prevent escape while remaining comfortable. Aurora read Hayes her legal rights in both standard human language and in the formal elf dialect used during official proceedings. She explained that everything Hayes had said would be recorded and used as evidence against her. She explained that she had the right to legal representation and would be given access to counsel. She explained that she would be transported to an intersystem, judicial facility where a panel of judges from multiple worlds would determine her guilt or innocence and sentence her accordingly. Hayes asked only one question. What about Commander Walsh? Where was he? How would he be brought to justice? Aurora explained that Walsh was more complicated. He had been promoted and transferred off-world. He was now beyond the jurisdiction of the colony, but the evidence that they had gathered, the communications logs and the financial records and the medical falsifications, would be enough to prosecute him in absentia. Aurora would personally carry this evidence to the Inter-System Council. She would present it before judges from a dozen different worlds. Walsh would be hunted. Walsh would be tried. Walsh would face justice even if it took years. With Hayes in custody, the mood of the colony began to shift. The soldiers who had been following Hayes' orders began to question what they had been participating in. The civilian staff, who had been too frightened to speak out, began coming forward with additional information. Within hours, Aurora's group had gathered even more evidence. They found encrypted messages from Walsh to Hayes discussing the cover-up. They found medical records that had been falsified to hide the truth. They found testimony from soldiers who had been ordered to destroy evidence and cover up the crash site. Victoria brought Aurora to see more people in the colony, people who had been waiting for the truth to emerge. An engineer named Patricia, who had wanted to refuse orders but had feared retaliation. A doctor named Sophia, who had treated victims of the massacre and had been forced to sign false reports. A communications officer named Grace, who had seen the encrypted messages and had been searching for someone who would listen. All of them had been trapped in a situation where speaking the truth would have cost them everything. All of them had been waiting for someone powerful enough and brave enough to force the truth into the light. Aurora understood now that Victoria's resistance had not been alone. There had been a network of people working secretly against Walsh's plans. People who had maintained their integrity and their humanity, despite working in a system that was corrupting both. These people deserved recognition. They deserved to know that their quiet resistance had mattered. They deserved to know that standing up for what was right, even in small ways, had made the difference between darkness and light. With the evidence secured and Colonel Hayes in custody, Aurora contacted the Inter-System Council to arrange for official transport and legal proceedings. They sent a high-level delegation within 3 days. Judges from 6 different worlds arrived at New Haven to begin formal investigations. Soldiers from the peacekeeping force took custody of Hayes and the other soldiers who had participated in the massacre. The colony's administrative structure was suspended pending a full review of what had happened under Walsh and Hayes' leadership. Aurora stood on the landing platform watching the official transport ship descend toward the colony. Ember and Thistle stood beside her, their magnificent forms silhouetted against the alien sky. Victoria joined them, placing her hand on Aurora's shoulder. The human woman asked what would happen now. Aurora explained that she would need to testify before the council. She would need to present all the evidence. She would need to serve as a witness for the prosecution against Walsh and Hayes. She would need to ensure that justice was not just served, but was seen to be served, so that the elf worlds would understand that at least some humans were willing to choose what was right. But there was something else, Aurora continued. There was something she needed to do first. There was someone in stasis beneath the colony who needed to be awakened. There was a diplomatic mission that had been interrupted 2 years ago that needed to be completed. There was her sister waiting in the darkness, waiting to be brought back into the light. Victoria smiled and squeezed Aurora's shoulder. Together they walked back down toward the underground medical facility, and the dragons followed them, and the future began to change shape. The process of awakening Lyra from stasis was careful and methodical, and filled with uncertainty. Victoria worked with precision, monitoring every vital sign as she began the slow process of bringing Lyra's body back from its frozen state. Aurora stood beside the pod, watching her sister's chest gradually begin to rise and fall with natural breathing. The machines beeped softly as Lyra's heartbeat returned to normal rhythms. Her eyes moved beneath closed lids as if dreaming after 2 years of dreamless sleep. Thistle and Ember waited outside the chamber, too large to fit in the confined space. But their presence was felt through the walls, their consciousness reaching out to acknowledge that another member of their expanding family was returning to the world of the living. It took 8 hours for Lyra to fully wake. When her eyes finally opened, Aurora was kneeling beside the stasis pod, her face close enough that Lyra's first conscious sight would be her sister's face. For a moment, Lyra simply stared, her mind struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. Then recognition flooded across her face, followed by confusion, followed by overwhelming emotion. She tried to speak, but her throat was dry from 2 years of silence. She tried to move, but her muscles were weak from extended suspension. Aurora carefully helped her sit up, supporting her weight, being gentle in a way that only came from love. Lyra's first words were confused questions. Where was she? How much time had passed? What had happened to the diplomatic team? Was the transport crash real, or had it been a nightmare? Aurora spoke slowly and clearly, explaining everything that had occurred. She told Lyra about Victoria's rescue, about the stasis pod, about the 2 years that had passed while her sister slept. She told Lyra about the conspiracy and the evidence and the capture of Colonel Hayes. She told Lyra that the worst of it was over, and the process of justice had begun. Lyra wept when she learned how much time had been stolen from her, how much of her life had been lost to suspension, but she also wept with gratitude when she learned about Victoria, when she understood that a human woman had given up safety and security to keep her alive. When Victoria entered the recovery chamber to begin Lyra's rehabilitation process, the two women embraced for the first time in years. The greeting was brief but profound, a moment of connection between two beings from different worlds who had chosen compassion and trust over fear and suspicion. Over the following weeks, Lyra recovered her strength while the Intersystem Council completed its investigation into the massacre. More evidence emerged with each passing day. The investigators traced the off-world contractors who had hired Walsh to carry out the attack. They discovered a network of military industries that had been attempting to acquire elf genetic material and elf technology for years. They found communications going back decades showing that this was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of exploitation and violence. Walsh had simply been one player in a much larger conspiracy. But in the midst of all this evidence and investigation and legal proceedings, something unexpected began to happen. The people of New Haven and the members of the elf worlds began to have conversations. Real conversations. Victoria invited Aurora to speak to the colony's residents about what justice truly meant. Aurora spoke about the pain of loss and the difficulty of choosing reconciliation instead of revenge. She spoke about Victoria's decision to protect Lyra despite all personal risk. She spoke about Marcus and Linda and David and all the humans who had stood against darkness in their own small ways. She spoke about how communities could heal when truth was faced and acknowledged. In return, representatives from the elf worlds visited the colony and spoke with the human residents who had resisted Walsh's orders. They acknowledged the courage it had taken for people like Victoria and Marcus and the others to stand against their own military structure. They recognized that humans had the capacity for both great evil and great good, just as all sapient species did. They recognized that the actions of a few criminals did not define an entire civilization. They recognized that cooperation and mutual respect were possible between worlds. 2 months after Lyra's awakening, the formal trial of Colonel Hayes began in an intersystem judicial facility, orbiting the outer moon of a neutral planet. Aurora testified for 4 days, describing the evidence and the conspiracy and the massacred diplomatic team. Victoria testified about how she had found Lyra and the decision she had made to save her life. Other colonists testified about Hayes' orders and her participation in the cover-up. By the end of the trial, the verdict was inevitable. Colonel Hayes was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, of crimes against the sapient beings of the elf worlds, of obstruction of justice, and of military misconduct. She was sentenced to 50 years of imprisonment with hard labor on a penal colony, a sentence that would likely consume the remainder of her life. Commander Walsh was tried in absentia, the evidence against him so overwhelming that conviction occurred even without his physical presence. He was declared a fugitive from inter-system justice, hunted by law enforcement across multiple worlds. It was known that he was hiding somewhere in the Outer Rim, moving between illegal settlements and criminal havens. But the warrant for his arrest would never expire. Sooner or later, he would be found and brought to face what he had done. As for Lyra, she was offered the choice of remaining on New Haven to help establish a formal diplomatic mission between the elf worlds and humanity, or returning home to her own people. Lyra chose to stay, at least for the time being. She and Victoria began working together to develop protocols for peaceful trade and cultural exchange between their worlds. They established educational programs where humans and elves could learn about each other's cultures and histories. They created frameworks for resolving disputes without violence and for cooperating on scientific research that benefited both species. Aurora remained at the colony for 6 months, longer than she had initially planned. Thistle and Ember made permanent roosts in the colony's outer regions, becoming familiar sights to the residents who had once feared them. The dragons participated in traditional elf ceremonies, including blessing rituals that humans were invited to observe. The fusion of two cultures began slowly, carefully, with constant negotiation and compromise and the willingness of individuals, like Victoria, to believe that understanding was possible. When Aurora finally did return to the elf worlds to report directly to the Inter-System Council, she brought with her detailed records of the investigation and the trial, and the evidence of human cooperation. She recommended that formal diplomatic relations be established with the human colony. She recommended that joint military agreements be negotiated to prevent future atrocities like the one that had occurred. She recommended that cultural and scientific exchanges be facilitated between the two civilizations. The council listened carefully to her recommendations. They voted unanimously to accept her proposals. Within a year, official embassies were established in both the human settlements and the elf worlds. Trade began to flourish. Technology was shared. Knowledge was exchanged. Relationships were built between individuals who represented two species that had once been on the brink of war. Victoria Monroe became the first human ambassador to the elf worlds, a position that allowed her to work for peace and understanding on an even grander scale. Lyra remained the elf ambassador to the human colonies, working alongside Victoria to build bridges between the stars. The two women became the living symbol of what was possible when individuals chose compassion over hatred. Aurora returned to the colony one more time, 6 years after her initial arrival. She brought her family, other elf warriors who had become diplomats and teachers. She brought Ember and Thistle, who were now legend among the human population. The settlement had transformed completely from the place where darkness had ruled under Walsh's command. It was now a beacon of cooperation and mutual understanding, a place where humans and elves worked side by side toward common goals. Standing on the same ridge where she had once planned destruction, Aurora looked out at the colony sprawling below. She thought about the warrior she had been, consumed by rage and the desire for vengeance. She thought about the warrior she had become, someone who understood that true strength lay not in the ability to destroy, but in the ability to build something better than what had come before. Victoria stood beside her, as she had so many times in the years between. The human woman smiled at the elf warrior and placed her hand in Aurora's, a gesture of friendship and solidarity. Together they watched the sunset over the alien landscape, knowing that they had played a small part in changing the course of history, that they had helped create a future where different worlds could share the stars in peace.